Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Andrew Burgee. I'm with the Yale class 1987, and I'm also on the YANA board. And I'd like to introduce you to John Bacon, who will be doing our today's presentation on plan giving. This is part of the Yale Alumni Non-for-Profit Alliance fundraising webinar sessions. And I'd like to introduce you to John before we begin. John Bacon, class of '85, is the Deputy Chief Development Officer for Plan Giving at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Before joining the Met in September 2017, John was the Director of Plan Giving at the New York Public Library for 14 years. John is also President Emeritus of the Philanthropic Planning Group of Greater New York. A trust estates attorney by training, he's active with the arts and the New York City community through the Friends of American Artists at Yale and the Historic Districts Council and the New York Public Library Radio Community Advisory Board. He's also a graduate of Yale College, the University of Delaware's Winter Third Program, and the Temple Law School. So without further ado, let's welcome John.
Thanks very much. And now's the next magic. Do I bring this up? Yeah. Obviously, technology is not my forte. There it is. Perfect. Thanks very much. With assist from Lou, here we are. Thank you for those who did the survey beforehand. That was very helpful for me. And I see we're from organizations of all different sizes and types. As was just mentioned, I've been on some boards of smaller organizations myself. So I understand that the stuff I'm going to talk about may not really apply directly to your work or your charity. But I think some of the basic tips and best practices can be used at a charity of any size. But I will focus on my experience working at two fairly large cultural charities, New York Public Library and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because they've had robust plan giving programs for some decades now that have become a very important part of the fundraising stream. And I think there are things to learn from what has been done at both institutions, and things probably also to not repeat or not do, or that may not apply to your organization. So what is a plan gift? A plan gift is one that is made in the context of the donor's overall financial and estate plan. Really, I would argue that any major gift is also a plan gift, and more we're seeing people doing blended gifts, so-called major gifts that include a plan or a deferred portion. So it really is any kind of a gift where it's not just someone writing you a check and expecting to do the same the next year, for instance. Often, but not always, the plan gift will defer payment to the charity for a period of years or until the donor dies. That is where the big leverage in plan gifts comes from. And to give you an example, just yesterday at the museum, we received a $500,000 bequest, partial distribution, from a lady who gave us less than $1,000 during her lifetime, but was able or felt to leave her legacy to the museum instead of making major gifts during her life. That's a very, very typical pattern. And I always highlight that to my colleagues who are chasing current dollars, that some of the deeper pockets can just take a little bit longer and may require a donor to die. Typical forms are listed there. Bequests under a will or living trust are by far the most important plan gift. Any charity can be left as a beneficiary in a will or trust, and that is where you want to be. Very little exposure for you, liability or otherwise, and that's where the big money is going to come. You can also be named a beneficiary of a financial account or an insurance policy, of a retirement account, etc. Those are probably the second most important way that we receive funds. Life income gifts are important. They're listed there: the charitable gift annuity, pooled income fund, and various charitable trusts. Think twice, think three times before you start to get involved in life income. These are complex, lots of legal and financial issues there, lots of risk. And really, I see them as loss leaders for a bigger integrated plan giving program. I will talk about them a little bit more though, because they are important to understand. Other irrevocable trusts include charitable lead trusts, life insurance trusts, and any number of tax motivated arrangements, very often with acronyms like GRAT. Well, anyway, GRAT's my favorite because it sounds so ugly, and it is ugly. It's a really aggressive strategy. Those are fabulous, but those are going to be motivated by the donor and more importantly, by the donor's advisors. You are not going to be taking a lead on creating a CLT, ILIT, or a GRAT or anything else. Those are going to come to you from the donor side. Just be aware of those. They can be incredibly beneficial, but they're also incredibly complex, and they're usually ticking time bombs for tax purposes if they don't work out well, especially lead trusts. Motivations. Tax planning is an important motivation for a lot of these gifts. The life income gifts I mentioned, people get a income tax deduction at the time of the gift for the amount that it's expected to go to charity in the future. Part of their payment is also tax-free if it's an annuity. And on the back end, for bequests and beneficiary designations, the amounts that go to charity are excluded from estate taxation or deducted depending on how they come in, both at the federal and state level. So we do see a fairly large volume of gifts that are tax motivated. People will give as much as they can to their families within the current regulations, which always are changing constantly, which is why trust and estate law is still a going practice. And then people will leave the overage sometimes to charity or in trust for other purposes. So some of it is tax motivated, but really people are giving you because of the mission. And I believe that unless the donor is giving because it's mission driven, that you don't really want that gift. And so at the bottom there, I mentioned transactional giving. And we have a fair number of donors who only give us money to fund charitable gift annuities, which is fine. I don't really think they have a charitable intention in mind. And at some level, that's not tax fraud, it's an extreme way of saying it, but it is very transactional. They want that nice tax benefited arrangement. They will support the museum or the library eventually, but I'm not really sure their heart's in it in some cases. And I call that transactional giving. Be very careful because those people can cause problems. And I think in really big cases, it could cause reputational damage if it was seen as not really a charitable arrangement. So just a word of caution there. But really people are giving to you because they love your mission. A snapshot of the NYPL program here on this slide. The library itself was founded in the late 19th century due to plan gifts. The Astor, Lennox, and Tilden gifts were very important. Astor and Lennox were materials, Tilden was cash, but that's not an uncommon mix. Many other bequests were received by the library for the first 90 years. But the planned giving program didn't start until the 1980s. And since that time, though, it's been consistently staffed with 2 to 4 professionals with defined responsibilities. I realize that almost no one on this call is going to be in a position to have a dedicated planned giving team, at least right off the get-go. But the library and the museum both invested in this area quite a ways back, and it's paid off rather nicely for them. We have the luxury of working full-time only in this area, working with our major gifts colleagues and membership, and it's worked out quite well. The library launched a pooled income fund in 1990 and a gift annuity program in 1993. Again, those are life income gifts that attract interest, but the real money is in bequests and beneficiary designations. So I see those as loss leaders to some degree. I had the library a really good one-page analysis showing all the expectancies and putting a value on them based on received gifts. That was a really great tool for me to show my boss and my boss to show his boss why it was worth having 3 dedicated people working in this area. Because we consistently raise $15 to $20 million a year of bequests under $1 million and as much more in larger bequests. So it really was a very what's the word I want? A good investment in terms of fundraising staff. The Met has a somewhat similar pattern, and a lot of the early growth of the museum was due to planned gifts both of art, and I list some of the more well-known donors, and money. And if you go to the museum today and look at the object labels, the credit line, very many to the tune of 60,000 will say Rogers Fund in the year. That was a $5 million planned gift made in 1905 by a gentleman named Mr. Rogers from Paterson, New Jersey, that has enabled the museum to do wonderful things in terms of acquisitions over 115 years, but a very important early bequest. Many other bequests in the first 100 years, but again, the plan giving program only started formally in the 1970s, consistently staffed again with dedicated professionals with defined responsibilities since that time. Also life income gifts for the same reasons we had them at the library. And I don't have a single page analysis yet at the museum because the database is so messed up, but that's another whole story. But there are literally hundreds of $1 million in expectancies and even more in art. And that's a big change for me, is that a lot of our plan gifts are art, and I don't technically get involved with those unless there's also a cash component. So big established programs. And I realize you might be thinking, why am I listening to this? Because this is not going to happen at my group ever. But just listen for some of the best practices. Bequests are king. All I can say is that bequests are great. You are a passive remainder man waiting for the money to come. Very few of them are disputed. Usually they're pretty easy to get. And if they're not, you can work with the Attorney General's office in New York, Charities Bureau, to help you. And it's really the way to go. Is if you do nothing else after hearing this, is put a little thing on your website that makes it clear that you are very happy to be named as a beneficiary in a supporter's will, and provide the language. Perhaps make sure you provide your legal address and maybe even your tax ID, although that's really not that important unless you're named your charity something very close to another charity. But that's a very simple thing any charity can do. And you'll be surprised. It may take 20 years, but you might get someone to sign up and leave you in their will. Trusts and life income gifts bring several forms of liability, which I already referred to. And at least some of these will be on you as the fiduciary. If you're doing life income gifts, in effect, you're investing those to help pay off the return that's being sent back to the donor in the form of annuity payments. So there's the issue of investment performance. If an annuitant lives to be 103, you are not going to get a large remainder, if any remainder, on that annuity. And I don't know about any of you, but for us, 90 is the new 80. People are living a lot longer. So we're seeing a lot of our annuities go underwater. In other words, they've gone through all the capital associated with their initial gift in the pool, and the rest of the annuitant pool is paying those people their annuities. So the point there is, unless you're going to have a large pool of life income gifts so that the whole thing behaves somewhat to the norm, don't go here at all. Just do not do it, because one person that outlives their expectancy could ruin the whole program. And I also think there's a severe potential conflict of interest if a charity serves as a fiduciary. It's bad enough to issue annuities, but if you serve as a trustee of a charitable trust and you're the remainderman, your interests are not squarely conflicting with the beneficiary, but there is some conflict there. So I think basically do not serve as fiduciary is probably the best way to get around that. And neither the library nor the Met, even with billion-dollar endowments, serves as fiduciary for that reason. And the real issue for all this stuff, the liability and the issues, is reputational damage. You do not want a plan gift to blow up and become an article in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Some of you may remember Princeton had a bad spell with a family a couple years back over use of a bequest. Don't let that happen to you, and be very aware of these downfalls, or what's the word I want? Downsides to some of these gifts. Stick with bequests. Prospecting. This is probably the most important thing I do on a forward-looking basis, is prospecting. And I think on our little survey, we asked whether people had a good database and whether it was well-managed, et cetera. Because if you do have a well-managed donor database with at least several thousand names, you have a reasonable plan giving pool, in my opinion. Even in the high hundreds could work out pretty well, especially if they skew older. What we do is we look through the database for certain patterns, and then we send them a mix of direct mail and e-communications, or a combination. And the combination seems to be most effective. We will send a standard piece of direct mail. This is a standalone appeal, by the way. It's not part of your traditional annual appeal or membership. It is a separate stream, separate appeal. And it can be done in combination with those, but it really is asking for a different kind of gift. So don't confuse them too much. Although we sometimes do use buck slips in membership appeals, especially renewals. Those are a very efficient way of getting after loyal donors. Just starting, one very tried and true way of doing this is to send a testimonial from a founder or well-regarded volunteer leader at your charity. I think you all know the type of person I'm talking about, with name recognition, a good story, someone whose name would actually resonate. Having them with a picture of them, either just a portrait or doing something at the charity, can be very, very effective. And it all gets to the point that people give to people. And I think having images on these communications is extremely important. And I tested that at the library, and it really did make an appreciable difference in the return rate on the mailings. Sorry, it's getting a little small, the type here, but if your database is large enough, you need to segment to target the people who are most interested and keep trying different segmentations. And I list the factors. That's probably the most important, those two middle bullets there. Age is paramount in our area. Older is better. 90 is fabulous, although I don't tend to go after people over 90 because that seems a little bit edgy. But the other big one is years of consistent giving at any level. So those $5 a year donors are really golden because they are so careful they end up being millionaires when they die. And if they don't have family, it's going to come to you, Baidawi, the library, the museum, Lincoln Center, whatever. That's a very common pattern we see. Recent giving is both good and bad. It means that they're still with us, but very often people will stop giving the last couple of years of their lives. Sometimes they move to be closer to family or a retirement community. So recent giving is a weird one, but we've tested it different ways to see if it made a difference. Engagement's critical. Trustees, volunteers are really probably your best candidates because they already are investing their time and very often their resources in your charity. Those are the kind of people who are going to be prone to consider a planned gift. The secondary factor is really family status is a primary factor. Single or older, widow or childless females are your key demographic. And I wish I could say it was single, older men, childless, but it's women in particular, really skews towards women. Childless couples are another very fertile area, pardon the expression, in this area, but the fact is they have no natural heirs or natural heirs who are not directly close to them. They're the ones who are going to look to your charity as part of their legacy. Size of the gifts, whoops. Size of gifts is interesting. I use that to kind of identify, I want to say unicorn, but very often you'll see a person who's given the standard dollar amount to your charity, then once or twice has given you a $5,000 gift or a $10,000 gift. That's usually a pretty good indication that they have capacity. And sure enough, they're the ones that end up giving 6 or 7 figure bequests because they do have money, they just don't choose to give it on a regular basis. So I look at that pattern. It's hard to factor it in a mailing, but it's something after the fact I see very commonly. Actually, your best planned giving donors are your current planned giving donors. People who do annuities tend to do them in serial fashion every year on their birthday or their actuarial birthday, and they really do talk it up with their friends. So planned giving donors, your volunteers who are planned giving donors are really great ambassadors and can talk it up along with your direct mail efforts. Prospecting using a direct mail vendor is pretty common. I think newsletters are kind of slowly dying and they're expensive. And I don't know about you, I get them at home and they all kind of run together at some point. I don't think that they're a great investment. And I think they may be a little bit generic, even if they let you brand them. But that is one way to do it if you really don't have the time or energy to do something internally. At the library, we sent out print testimonials to 30,000 supporters annually out of what we call 60,000 active supporters. Those are people who've made at least one financial gift in the last 12 months. Used to do a real blunderbuss. We split it A, B, and just shot them out there. And when we got back a pretty good return, it was acceptable. And when I say 30,000 pieces of mail, if we got back 200 qualified returns, that would be acceptable. So it's a numbers game here. Then more recently, before I left the library, we did a lot more segmentation, and I used a willingness algorithm, very crude one, but very effective, to winnow down the list, and sent a lot less mail and got exactly the same results. So we saved some money, we're talking to the right people, and it was really a much more efficient policy. And then we, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, follow up the print solicitation with an email containing exactly the same information, even the same template, so it just reinforces the message. And we were getting more and more email addresses, but that was a little issue because we did not have a really good email overlay and no demographic overlay at all at the library, which was a problem. That's something that you might want to consider if you're going to get into this in a big way, is purchasing a demographic overlay. Can be kind of cheap, can be kind of useful if it helps you winnow through your database. And then finally, a new colleague convinced me to do a brochure. I hate brochures, but we created one and mailed it to a slightly larger group. It was not cheap, although 14,000 may not sound so bad because it was roughly 20,000 pieces. But that's been a really good piece of collateral to use in follow-up and at other meetings. So I think it was actually a pretty effective tool. Results. Yeah, so we got a couple hundred a year between the two mailings. And those qualified responses would generally yield between 20 and 40 new commitments. I don't know if that's me. It looks good on this screen, but I guess the big one's different. Smaller targeted mailings in recent years, as I said, had the same results. The brochure mailing was great. And the big thing here is to try different things constantly. I know it sounds like a lot of work, it is, but if you have a good marketing team, a good graphics team, or any kind of helpers to help you with this, slice, dice, change it up, see how things work, and always remember it's about your mission. Tax and other stuff is important, but unless it's reaching out to people and talking about your mission, it's not going to be an effective mailing. Prospecting at the Met. Plan Giving gets a centerfold in a newsletter that gets circulated to several thousand donors. Higher level donors. That is extremely efficient because these are the high capacity donors, but it's a lot less people than I would like. So we also send targeted mailings to members and annual fund donors up to about 35,000 pieces a year, and a buck slip, as I mentioned, in an annual appeal. And we use buck slips to advertise in a estate and gift planning seminar that we offer. Our recent life income mailing at the museum was not very successful, but again, people do reply, and sometimes it will take multiple iterations of that to get them to finally commit. So it's a long-term drip kind of process, and that's really how the direct mail works. And I'm going to try some different things there and hope that it works out well, and we'll see how it goes. But other ways to prospect. Websites. The libraries is fairly poor. Maybe it's changed since I was there and looking at it a lot, but I don't know. The Met's is better, and we're changing it again currently. Those generate a pretty consistent flow of inquiries. And what we really want is for people to call and to start talking to us. And really, it's all about that dialogue with people is where you're really going to get traction in this area. So it's great to present the information on the website, but unless they follow up and contact you in person, you're just going to have a passive person out there in the ether, and you really want to start talking to them, even if it's just over the phone. There are web-based alternatives. I list some prospecting tools. MarketSmart was trying to get in this space for a while. That can be great, and there are some vendor-generated PG websites which are pretty nifty. Again, I think they're probably a little overkill, and they're full of bells and whistles you don't need. You want people to call you. You don't want to give them all the information on the site, unless it's the very simple thing about how to make a bequest to your charity. That should be on everyone's website somewhere on your website. Estate and gift seminars, I used to give a lot of those while I was at the library. I actually enjoyed it, so it wasn't a big burden. And those generated a consistent flow of inquiries. And a lot of people self-identified bequest intentions on the evaluation form. And at the Met, we do one outside one. An outside person comes in and does one, and it's more of an evening event than an educational thing. But they can be an effective way of identifying prospects and qualifying leads, as I note on the slide. Kind of on the back end of all this is stewardship. So you've prospecting, you've identified people, they say that you're in their plan or they do a life income gift. They then become a member of your legacy society. And I hope some of you have these. If you don't, consider creating one, because it can be an effective way of creating an identity for these people and keeping them very near and dear until their gift matures. Very, very important. At the library, we had a Bigelow Society that had roughly 1,000 members, and the Met Williams Society actually has closer to 900 members now. But those are long-standing legacy societies that people really identify with. And at the Met, they even give you a pin to wear, and people, when they come see me, wear the little pin. So it's that kind of a thing. What do you do with these societies? At the library, I offered way too many events, including a formal tea each spring, which I hated every single spring when it came up, but the donors loved it. And if they had known how much it cost, I think they all would have left screaming, but they didn't. So that was good. It was on site there, but it cost roughly $100 a head for those ladies to sit down. And they were almost all ladies, but they loved it. And I got regularly about 300 members of the society to come to that event, that one event. The Met, we have a lot of fancier things, but fewer, although I just gave a walking tour this morning at the Met for our society members. And I did a lot of walking tours at the library. So things like that. Again, always trying to tie it to the mission. Having a curator at the museum or even at the library, a librarian talk is always a surefire way of getting them closer to you or staying close. But just logical things. Doesn't have to be anything too fancy, but make sure you have some programming and not just a passive group. Communications, I send a biannual letter listing the upcoming events and giving opportunities to every single member. We hand sign all the letters and add little things on them. People love that. We send birthday and holiday cards to roughly half of the members. The birthday ones we know because they're annuitants. The birthday is part of the data they have to give us. And I regularly send about 50 a month of those. And then just general donor communications. They get a lot of things from the museum, but we also make sure that things that are of particular interest to people, we send to them. All common sense. It takes a lot of time, a little bit of touch, but that's the thing that makes it really sticky. That's when the donors really start to love you and your organization. And most importantly, probably for many of us, the members are listed in the annual report unless they prefer not to be. And tweaking that opt-in, opt-out thing is fairly important because people can get irate if they're listed and they don't want to be. That's been my only experience there, negative. Otherwise, annual report's a no-brainer. And both places now, they only do it online, so it doesn't even cost anything anymore, no printing or anything. The back end, this is now when your loyal people have died and you're starting to get things to collect. Estate administration, you should know, or someone on your staff should know, or maybe even a volunteer or a trustee will know about the basics of probate in your jurisdiction. I happen to be a trust and estates attorney, so I knew some of that going in. But I spend at least one day a month down at surrogates court looking at files to see how estates are going and who cut us out of their will, that kind of thing. But that's useful to do if you have a big program like we do. And as I said here, if you don't have that expertise in-house, you can get outside help as needed, either pro bono or paid. Paid help is very good because they have a responsibility to help you. Pro bono can be great if they're on top of it, but be aware you're getting what you pay for, which is sometimes nothing, especially if it's a well-meaning attorney who's is not even their area. You'll see what you get. Life income gift administration. We work with a third-party vendor, and I'd say unless your program is going to be big enough so you're in that position, don't even start one, because it's really, really a lot of liability, a lot of tax reporting, a lot of financial risk, and it's really not worth getting involved in that. The bottom point's extremely important. Some estates will take years and tiers before full distribution is made. Some are litigated. And so be aware that if you're going to receive estates, you may have to do some work to wrest the money from the estate. In New York, the Charities Bureau can be an advocate in really difficult situations. And I assume, or in fact, I know there are similar watchdogs in other states and countries. I mentioned countries because I usually do this presentation for Europeans, and this is all foreign to them, but it's pretty interesting. What did I say here? Yeah. How to use the money. I spent a lot of time in my initial time at the library talking about this because I had an annual budget goal for realized bequest dollars, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because we can't generally time when people are going to die, at least I hope not. And then we can't time the distributions from their estate. The good news is I had enough flow of money from there that I met my $5 million budget every year. But then we changed it so there you see in the middle that all unrestricted bequests the library receives are now board designated an endowment. That was a really, really good move because within 8 years after that policy was in place, we raised over $100 million in such endowment, which threw off roughly the $5 million that was my original goal. So I thought that was a really good policy, pushed very hard by our board chair, who was a kind of a hard-bitten corporate lawyer, but he was a fabulous partner to work with. The Met policy, everything at the Met is more complicated and more tedious, but anyway, their policy is that only gifts over 100,000, these are unrestricted gifts, I might add, become board designated endowment. Smaller ones the curators get to use and are very fierce about using. So we have to have a little lottery every spring when we look at what's come in. That is going to change. I'm not going to put up with that anymore because it's really stupid. Restricted gifts. Both institutions I've worked for are big enough to honor donor-imposed restrictions, so long as they're pretty consistent with our mission and operations. I've had to reject 2 bequests, now 3, that had nothing to do with our mission, and it just didn't seem appropriate to take the money, but that's going to be exceptional in most cases. Overly restricted gifts you can sometimes talk to the estate about releasing a restriction, although usually you're working with a will and the person's dead, so it's a little hard to get that to happen. You can also go to court and do what is a cypre proceeding, and that's asking the court for relief. But that's expensive. You're not sure you're going to prevail. That is really only done in situations where you have a lot of money at stake and you really want to be able to use it. Or a settlement. Both institutions I worked for were involved in Mrs. Astor's estate, and that ended up being settled, which was the best way for everyone to get through that one. But again, I strongly encourage you not to consume realized bequests unless your organization is such that you need to, but you could consider making it board designated endowment, kind of rainy day money, because that money can be recharacterized by the board in the future to use for operations or a project. And it might be a great way of starting an endowment if you're at a smaller charity. And I should say restricted gifts are really, can be tricky. At the museum, the majority of gifts we receive are restricted and very often pretty highly restricted. So it's a little different than what I knew at the library. Other back-end considerations. If other charities are named in the donor's estate plan, and that is extremely common, work together, especially if there are any problems. I spend 3, 4, 5 times a week, I'm talking with other charitable beneficiaries about problem estates. Currently with Brown University, it turns out. So it's good to have allies and to talk things through and present a unified front. Recognition, we did none other than listing in the annual report unless the gift instrument required naming, a plaque, or other recognition. And if you do any so-called permanent recognition, make sure you limit the duration. 50 years is very common these days, and both the library and the Met are in city-owned buildings, and the city requires it be 50 years maximum duration. In practice, I don't think that's going to be honored, but that's the theory, is that it's a limited time. So think about that if you're giving people away, doing a sidewalk or something. Don't expect it's going to be there forever. Surviving family, I handle these case by case, but be sensitive especially to surviving spouses. There's no reason generally not to be unless they're causing a lot of trouble. But I do stand up, and you should stand up to unhappy disinherited heirs, i.e. children, if their parents' intentions are clear. And this is a very common thing. Effectively, the big money is going to charity. The kids get a kiss-off gift, and sometimes it really is pretty bad. It's a real kiss-off. But unless there's some reason to believe that there was some error there, we will honor the intentions expressed in the will, and you should too. And very often they'll fish with a lawyer, and we'll just say we've read within the 4 corners of the documents, very clear what they want done. So I think we would fold for a spouse. And again, part of this is not ending up in the news with a widow saying that the museum stole her husband's money. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you know what I'm talking about. Some final thoughts. Plan giving works best if your donor database is reasonably large and well managed. That is the mine you're going to be working in. And I should mention that our big base at the library was membership. Regular $40 members, $100 members were the real sweet spot, and the higher level members were great for capacity. At the museum, it's similar, although again, everything's twice scale-wise. But if you have a really good membership team and colleagues and a good database, that's really the tool set you need. And I think it's really important if the plan giving effort is adequately funded as part of development efforts, ideally with a dedicated staff, at least part if not full-time. And again, I realize that many people on the webinar are not in that position and never will be in the foreseeable future. But if you really want to do this big time, it does help to have dedicated staff time, if not expertise. The second point there in the middle is extremely important. If your board and the management are not buying into this, you're not going to succeed. And I've been on a board of several smaller charities where plan giving is given a lot of lip service, but nothing ever gets done. And it's not being consistently messaged at all. But it really is a long-term investment with long-term and not always reliable return. So it's kind of a leap of faith initially, but if you really do it well and do it consistently over time, and I think consistency is probably the most important thing, messaging and having a consistent communication style, you can really do extremely well. And the bottom point we've talked about before, focus on bequests and beneficiary designations, and secure these from your board and other influencers, especially people who might provide testimonials. And you've got to keep your pipeline full, or else you're going to have very irregular returns. So both at the library and at the museum, I have probably at the museum $500 million of expectancies out there, and that will over time produce a consistent flow of roughly $20 million a year in terms of realized bequests. Library was a little bit less, but it was also very, very consistent. So we were able to tell the administrators, even with the variables of people's lifespan, et cetera, that we were going to raise at least $15 million a year, and they could rely on us to do so. And I say, just forget life income plans unless you're already doing this or a trustee comes with a gun to your head. But if that's the case, try and work with a community trust or a bank. Do not do it yourself unless you have a wonderful finance team. They'll hate you if they start to have to do these things on the side. So don't do them. And timely and consistent communications, interactions with prospects, advisors, committed donors, estate reps, regulators, vendors, and peers is critical. I talk to all of those different people on a regular basis. Advisors is very, very important. You should have at least someone on your staff who can talk to the donor's lawyer with some authority about this, and not just punt it. Because if the advisor gets a sense that you don't know what you're doing, you may not be included in the estate plan. So the third bullet, put simply, plan giving is all about creating and maintaining relationships with your core supporters and eventually their estates. Be professional but personal, and never forget your organization's mission and your role. I read that verbatim because I have to remind myself of all this. The hardest part of all is not becoming too friendly with some of these people and forgetting that you're working as a fundraiser for a charity, not their friend or their personal assistant. And I've become a little too close to many people over time in the last 15 plus years. And that has been good for my work, but it sometimes hasn't always been totally professional. So this is an area where you can get a little too much information about people. You can end up in their home when they have a fall, any number of situations that become a little bit extraordinary and not totally professional. But just remind yourself why you're doing this and what it's for. And it always should be supporting the organization's mission. And even if your group is small, it can be a significant source of support. I dare say that for the charities I've been on the board of, $100,000 bequests would have been a total windfall. And at the museum, that's roughly the average size of bequests we receive from all donors. So make sure your supporters know you welcome plan gifts, especially bequests and beneficiary designations. So I'm sorry I kind of raced through that, but I want to leave time for questions. And I have a final screen on resources, which you can read on your own. I am happy to share copies of some of the documents I referred to briefly in the presentation, namely the one-page analysis I did at the library and the willingness algorithm I did there. If those are of interest, you can just email me at the address there if you want those, and I'll be happy to send you PDFs. And otherwise, I think we're ready for questions. Okay. I have one question, which is, what is a willingness algorithm? Quite simply, it's a way of putting numbers onto those factors we talked about earlier. Let me go back to that. And weighing the factors, age, years of consistent giving, recent giving, less so, engagement, very much so, family status, very much so, size of gifts, yes. So I gave those a numerical weight. Years of consistent giving was the most important because we didn't always have age for donors at the library. So I had to devalue that. But these got a numerical ranking, and then I broke it down into deciles, and we would mail only to the top 3 or 4 deciles, if that makes any sense. Any other questions? I don't know if we... Yes.
For younger, smaller organizations, John, what sort of plan giving strategy would you recommend for them?
Yeah, I hope I was clear. For younger, smaller organizations that may have even a single development person, at a minimum, make sure that you, in your written communications and on your website, mention that you are very happy to receive requests to benefit your ongoing operations. You can call them legacy gifts, whatever you want to call them. Provide the information on how a donor can put your charity into their plan, and probably give a number of the person they should talk to if they or their advisor has a question. And again, having someone who can talk about this with some confidence is important, especially if an attorney gets involved. But it's very, very simple. That will cost you nothing. And the main thing is to do it consistently, especially in those donor communications. If you send out a newsletter, have a sidebar or a box that mentions this in it. I did that at the library for X number of years very effectively. And now I have the centerfold at the museum that's pretty effective as well. But it's a little bit of real estate in the communication, but it can be very, very valuable. And the main thing is not to expect immediate results unless the person's on their deathbed, and even then, the money's not going to come in for a period of time. So this, again, is a very long-term prospect, but one that can be incredibly rewarding if you get a good effort going, or even a somewhat passive effort, but again, consistent messaging is the most important thing. And I think I've been lucky to work at 2 big, older mainline charities. Some of the ones I've been a board member of and still a board member of are relatively young. Some people are leery of doing a legacy gift to a charity that may not be around in 10 years, and be cognizant of that. If you're in a cause-related charity with a very particular focus, it may be hard for someone to make a leap of faith and to consider you as part of their estate plan. Having said that, there's no reason why they couldn't do it, but just be aware of that. I know I have personal thoughts about when I'm a board member and I can't see putting them in my will, because I honestly don't think they're going to be around in 10 years. But that's just a consideration.
Donna K wants to ask a question. We're going to let her go live.
Okay.
We asked Donna to speak.
Donna, do you want to ask your question?
Yep, I was just included you in their will. And you say, wonderful, you are now part of our legacy society. Do you confirm that commitment? And also, what is your email?
So I'm sorry, you say someone's identified a bequest intention.
Do you confirm it?
Yes, we will send them a welcome letter into the Legacy Society, somewhat formal. We will ask if they want their name published in the annual report. Generally, we'll allow them to opt out as opposed to opting in. And then we'll send them this biannual communication at a minimum going forward, unless they tell us that they no longer want to be a member.
Okay. And your email?
My email is john.bacon@metmuseum.org. It's on the last slide there. Whoops.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I can send, if anyone wants to send me an email, I'm happy to send them a PDF of the slides. Although I'm not sure if YANA does that too. Okay, well, they'll be posted on the YANA website, so I apologize. But again, if you want the other information, feel free to send me an email. I have a question here from one of our live listeners. Is a bequest legally binding? A bequest becomes legally binding the second the testator dies. So yes, when you die, your will language is irrevocable for obvious reasons. Up until that point, it is entirely revocable. And we've all seen the movie where the old man has all of his family come into the room and then he rips apart the will. He is revoking his will and effectively disinheriting them. I guess that's the story in the movie. But if he dies without doing that, the bequest is binding. And that's why if we're named in a will and it's not at all, no signs of undue influence or coercion or anything, we will fight to get our bequest, regardless of whether it makes any sense for the donor's family or anything else, because it is a legally binding gift by that donor, regardless of his family status, whether he hated us at the moment he died. It doesn't matter, it's a legally binding obligation of his estate. And the other good question here is, what if the size of the estate is much smaller than expected? That happens very often, although usually in my experience, it's just the opposite, that people end up being the millionaire next door. We have any number of people, your old teacher who lives on 2nd Avenue in a white brick building. She probably never spent a dime on herself, went to Europe maybe twice, that was the big thing. Has a couple of nieces and nephews, but they're not nice and they don't send her cards. So again, charities are gonna get everything in her estate. Get a pension, so she wasn't spending a dime out of her retirement account, and her white brick apartment is worth $1 million too. So you end up getting a couple $100,000 from people like that. Usually that's the case rather than smaller. The ones where we've had trouble are large specific bequests. Those are specific dollar amounts that people give in advance or at the beginning of their will from large donors. Lo and behold, many of them overextend themselves charitably while they're alive, and those specific bequests will abate in their will. They'll be reduced according to the amount of money available to pay all specific requests. And I've had more than one of those from names you'd recognize. Their names are on buildings all around town, where they've done a lot of giving while they're alive, frankly, probably a little too much giving. And the bequest language becomes problematic because the estate's not big enough. Or frankly, they've salted all the money away in trusts, and so there's not an estate per se. Yeah, and there's a question here about size of the donor database to be effective. I would still think it should be in the thousands, but if you're in the high hundreds and have a good quality of donor, it can't hurt to try some communications on this area. Just don't expect to get more than a handful of replies, if that. It's really the volume's important only because you'll get a relatively small percentage reply, and even a smaller number of those will be really what I'll call qualified replies. We get a lot of flames to our mailings. People send back dimes taped onto the reply card. You've all seen this too, I imagine, or know what I'm talking about. But the volume's important only because it's a real reduction in the actual reply. I'm not sure I made that clear, but the percent that replies is very, very small. And the critical thing there is keep doing it. You may think, oh, but the 5th or 6th time that person gets the mailing, they'll send in a card. And very often it will be a card from 3 or 4 iterations ago. We always code ours on the reply device. And they must sit on these for years in that drawer in their kitchen. And sure enough, they'll send it in eventually if you kind of wear them down. I call it dripping, whatever you want to call it, but it's that consistent messaging over time is really the important thing. If you do this once, but if you don't really have it as part of your overall appeal, it's going to wither on the vine and just be there doing nothing. Donna asked, do you confirm the commitment? I guess we talked about this. I didn't mean to suggest that we force them to send a copy of the will. We do not. I find that is a little bit invasive. That can turn people off. We just assume that they're going to do it. And sure enough, 1 out of 10 times when a Legacy Society member dies, we're not in the final plan. Very often they've moved out of state and just kind of out of mind. But we go down to surrogates court and sometimes we find we're not in the final plan. So just the way it is. Catherine asks, with the naming opportunity, how do you address the fact with the donor that the object name might not be around forever? My example of a sidewalk. I hope donors are more rational than that and realize times and things change. I don't know if any of you know the parks, Central Park benches, but those get cycled through on a pretty regular basis because they don't last. The kind of permanent recognition I'm most familiar with is internal on plaques at the museum in particular. They're chipped into stone and it's very ritual and it's very complicated. It's also extremely expensive to do that. But that's the kind of permanent thing I was talking about. And you just have to set expectations and limit them. We have the nice excuse of the city imposing a limit, although I'll tell you that there's a name on a building a few blocks from here that is in perpetuity that kind of flaunts that. $100 million gift, but still. Alicia asks, what's the percentage breakdown between digital and traditional mail appeals to your donor base? Which seem most effective to a particular purpose or ask? With the older demographic, direct mail is still most effective, in my opinion and my experience. But the email one is so much easier and cheaper from your perspective. But I think it's the hybrid model where you send a piece of mail, then you follow up with the e-communication. That's, I think, is the way to go. If you can do that. We use a 6-week interval between the two communications. That seems to be about right. 8 weeks is probably a little too long, depending on holidays, etc. Time of mailing, we do a lot of this mailing in late summer, which seems a little counterintuitive, but that's a very slow time for other kinds of gifts. Then we don't fall on the annual appeal. And then we do it again now in the dead of winter, when our membership friends are not very busy. And that seems fine. It's a standalone appeal, a very different appeal than they're making. And those seem to be fine periods for me to do it. Mainly so no one else is complaining I'm sending mail. Oh, there's one. Amy Kornbluth asks, do you recommend using outside counsel, a law firm, to manage all estate gifts and paperwork? If you have someone doing that pro bono for you, great. I would not hire someone to do that. I think it's pretty straightforward. Having said that, I'm a trained lawyer, so maybe it's my bias there. A lot of internal control is very, very helpful because some of the stuff's very sensitive. But I'm not aware, put it different ways, I'm not aware of anyone that does not have either in-house counsel or in-house staff handling this. Most commonly, if it's the situation I think you're getting at, Amy, will be done by your finance department. If they're at all robust and competent, finance may be the best way to go if the development staff doesn't have time or expertise to do this. That's my favorite part of the job, by the way, is the estate admin. I really love reading receipts and releases and accounts. But that's just, yeah, based on legal experience. And to give you an idea, at the museum, until I came, our general counsel's office did all the administration. And she was so happy when I said I wanted to take it over. I cannot tell you, that's earned me a lot of big cred there. But that part's very, very important. And it's really easy to do if you do a lot of kind of regular follow-ups. So we have a calendar of regular follow-ups for gifts that are still not in, gifts that are halfway through, et cetera, et cetera. And it's based on an annual cycle keyed into our fiscal year, which is June 30th. But again, that's the luxury of having dedicated staff and resources to do this work. But we have a consistent flow of a couple hundred estates open at any given time. So we have to be pretty efficient about doing it that way. That might be it. Any other questions from the live? So don't fear. You may not start a huge program right away, but again, any 501c3 can receive a bequest with the benefits to the donor that we described. And most importantly, these can be really foundational gifts for your charity for its future. And that's really the proposition that we present to people at the museum and at the library, is that if you want this service, these services to be around for the future, for future generations, for future New Yorkers, consider making us part of your legacy. and they do on a regular basis to everyone's gratification. All right. Well, thanks. I think we're done.